years before something came along, before something else came along as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of a decentralized decision-making structures is precisely to prevent or to reduce the vulnerability to the whim of somebody higher up the decision-making structure, scuppering work that's being done. So the idea that you have specialized units that know their business and have the expertise to carry out their business should have an equivalent discretion over how they improve, how they change practice, etc., etc. Rather than that your most important responsibility is to be meeting the expectations of a remote and centralized decision-making structure.
So a group, a unit might have the discretion to say, we won't do whatever the flavor of the month just now.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Okay, so the other aspect that there's lots of support for in the literature is networks. One of these buzzwords, I'll be talking about leadership a bit later on, that's another buzzword, but there is some support for the idea that networks can be important in breaking out of those organizational structures and silos that can impede flexible working and outward-facing inner practice. So networks, that's a brief definition. As I say, they do receive lots of support in the literature. When they work well, networks are an important way of doing the kind of collaborative exchange, information exchange, and co-working that is essential for innovative practice. Yeah?
Sorry, how do organizations come together? Like, isn't it people in organizations that come together?
Yes.
Or are you talking about like all people? Like, what does that mean?
I mean, I suppose the point is that people from in separate organizational structures on behalf of their organizations come together, so that we're not just working within our organizational boundaries.
So are you talking about just the formal collaboration between organizations?
No. So the idea of a network ideally combines formal and informal elements. So, I mean, the literature suggests that networks need to have some institutional support. They need some formal footing in order for them to be taken seriously and for there to be commitment from organisations. But if they're just another structure, parallel structure to the organisations that are involved in them, then you lose the informal element of people exchanging experiences, coming together to talk about their own feelings, perceptions around a new particular way of working, or the competencies that you may require as a professional to actually implement new ways of working. So the idea of a network should be that it combines the kind of sure footing of institutional support, organisational support, without being over prescriptive. So you have those elements of informal knowledge exchange as well as just the formal transfer of evidence and so on and so forth. Now it's contentious because networks, there have been multiple attempts to set up networks that haven't been successful, and nobody as yet has necessarily worked out the magic bullet for successful network development. But when they work well, the claims that are made for networks are that they facilitate tacit as well as explicit knowledge, and this is the point I'm making about those things that you can't get in a technology assessment report or a clinical guideline. Those aspects of knowledge, experience, expertise of people, particularly on the ground, their competencies and so on, which are crucial for adoption and diffusion of new ways of working. So the knowledge management literature says that tacit knowledge exchange is equally as important as accessing the latest control trial or so on and so forth. So networks are seen as a vehicle for this type of knowledge exchange as well as dissemination of evidence. And in this respect, they're seen as helpful in overcoming problems, increasing learning. They can help to address problems of scale for smaller organisations that don't necessarily have the resources. So we've seen that organisational size can be a proxy for readiness for smaller organisations can link in with bigger organisational networks and resources through networks. And also, if they're cosmopolitan, very broad church, networks can actually reach out beyond the healthcare provider organisations to include the users of technology of services, and also producers, so those responsible for generating new ways of working, new products, and so that the whole process, front to back, can be a bit more coordinated. And another phrase that you'll hear in the literature quite often is communities of practice. So it's a type of network. So some words of caution on networks. There are multiple network forms, and we don't quite know yet which ones are necessarily most suited to innovation. So you can have information sharing networks, you can have professional networks, and the spectrum of how formalised the networks are and how informal. So some work needs to be done beyond just saying, okay, let's set up a network. It's not as simple as that. Networks need institutional support, but if there's too institutionalised, people will, you won't get the level of informal, tacit knowledge exchange. They won't be allowed to develop in a way to evolve in a way that's most useful. Network involvement clearly has to have some, but you can't compel people to be part of a network and then expect them to be positive about the network. So again, there's a tension here about how do we get people to be involved? What are the incentives? Is it just exhortation? Tell them how great it will be if the benefits they'll receive, or are there other ways of incentivising involvement?
So that actually makes me think about the whole idea of tacit knowledge exchange and communities of practice. And the classic, the original book on communities of practice, talked about how that worked. But how can an organization, you can't make it work, but how can it create the environment in which that might work?
Yeah, a good question, Linda. And again, not one that I necessarily have the magic bullet for. So how can an organisation create incentives to involvement in this?
I'd say it a little bit differently. How can an organisation remove, I think people naturally form into communities of practice, unless there are, unless there's blockages in the way that they have to do their job that prevent them from doing that.
Yeah.
So it almost feels like how can an organization remove the barriers to allow natural communities of practice to grow and function?
There is some work on how you create the ideal network, and maybe perhaps we'll come back to it in the light of what we've got at the end, because there'll be more expertise in the room. Certainly, I imagine in the ether via the. Do you have a question?
I was just wondering if you looked at all about the use of technology in networks, or
No, absolutely. There's lots of work around the use of web technology, for example, and one of the good practices we identified, I'll talk about in a moment. So yes, I think increasingly there are kind of technical solutions or but the evidence on the extent to which this solves the problem of getting people together, or of removing barriers or creating incentives. So often what you'll get with a new website or a database that people are encouraged to network through is that you'll get an initial glut of activity which tails off. So finding ways of making it more sustainable, of that evolving and so on. I'm sure there are technical challenges, but also I think it's about understanding broader issues of why and when people will engage. Okay. So professional and cultural values to be overcome. So some professional networks, as we know in healthcare, can actually do the opposite. They can be stifling of innovation if they're very closed, if they're very hierarchical. And so the idea is that you capitalise on the weak ties between groups that perhaps don't traditionally or routinely come into contact with each other, rather than just cement existing professional networks. But the risks of doing that is that it's difficult to sustain networks which have membership which is very diverse. So again, just throwing out some disclaimers and some caveats about the networks